In the world of strength sports, there are very few lifts more important than the deadlift, and probably none. But there are a couple of deadlifts that stand out well amongst any others that have been done. And both of these come from strongmen, and they come from two really, really close friends. Sort of, not really. Thor has deadlifted 510 kilos and Eddie Hall has deadlifted 500 kilos. This became a major controversy when Thor broke Eddie's 500 kilo deadlift with a 501 kilo deadlift in his home gym during COVID when he didn't have a choice to do it elsewhere. Then that was put to rest at 505 kilos a couple of months ago over in Germany, and then further put to rest, nail in the coffin, send it off. It was actually sent off for cremation after this, I believe, lifting 510 kilos like it was absolutely nothing. But I've been thinking about this, and it really brings up the debate. Is the 500 more important, or is the 510 more important? And it's not really that question alone. The question is actually, what is more important? Nostalgic, historic markers of strength, or purely strongest lift of all time? I've been struggling with this one. Now, before I get into my own explanation and my own decision, I want you to pop in the comments. What do you believe is more relevant? What should we give more credence to? The 500 kilo deadlift or historical markers of strength, or the 510 kilo deadlift, which is the greatest deadlift of all time? And this expands into every other facet of strength sports. Should we give the most respect to the person who lifted the most amount of weight, full stop, or more respect to the person who lifted the most amount of weight relative to what the other people at the time were lifting? And I believe this is the primary consideration for Eddie's lift. The record before he said it was 463 kilos. He came out and said he was going to deadlift 500. That is ridiculous. It was ridiculous. That was not feasible based on anything anyone had ever seen before. He then increases it by 37 kilos in a night. What's really cool about this is it wasn't a Roger Bannister moment. I don't know if I got that name right. Close. The guy who set the first 4-minute mile, or broke the first 4-minute mile. That then triggered a whole bunch of other people to realize it was possible and break it and break it and break it and break it. And tons of people broke it in the first couple of years after Roger Bannister, or something close to that name, broke it. Shout out to you. You're fast as hell.
Regardless of whether you think it's Thor or Eddie, there's no doubt that deadlift is the king of all exercises. And that's why I've released a 12-week program, the one that I use to deadlift 475 kilos at 320 pounds body weight. That's down at the link in the description. And it's 12 weeks of education along with 12 weeks of programming, starting with 1 week of RP, and then I'll prescribe for you week after week what weight should you use to hit an all-time personal best and get your deadlift to where it needs to be.
Now, what Eddie did is he showed people it was possible. People realized it was possible. Obviously, they saw it happen and then couldn't do it and couldn't do it and couldn't do it, and I couldn't do it, and I thought I could do it and I couldn't, and I tried and I tried and I tried. And I'll continue to try, and eventually one day I will. But he showed the world that that was possible, and 500 kilos was such an unfathomable number. It's such a round number that it feels hard to replicate with anything in the foreseeable future. At 510 kilos, we're getting into 1,100 pounds. The next sort of benchmark lift would probably be 1,150. It's not really that sexy. Even 1,200 isn't really that sexy. 500 kilos is sexy. It just feels good. But it's not as good as lifting 510 kilos. Now, I run into this problem all the time when I'm trying to evaluate how historical strongmen compare to strongmen of today, because I just don't understand how we can look at someone like, oh man, who do I want to throw under the bus? I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus. We look at someone from old-time strongman. Let's say their maximum log was 155 kilos. At the time, that was the biggest lift. It wasn't even a question. And let's say the first time they did the Flintstone press, it was 205 kilos to win the event. Then we did it way later, all the way in my first World's Strongest Man in 2022, 205 kilos. And 205 kilos would have earned you 9th spot, I believe, at World's Strongest Man in 2022. Does that mean that all of those guys are better and should be treated with more respect than the guy who lifted that way back in the day? And the answer is, I don't really know. We're going to unpack it. I'm going to give you an answer, but up to date, I didn't really know. Now, what I would have said until I started thinking about this, the exact same thing with the 500 and the 510, is that, of course, the person who lifts more should always deserve more respect. That is just full stop. If we're talking about greatness in strength sports, the beauty of strength sports is that you either lift the weight or you don't lift the weight. And there's no real judgment to be had unless you get a sort of down call, or an up call, whatever it was. Shout out Magnus. Tough. If you know, you know. But I thought, lift more weight and you good. And that's the beauty of strength sports, is we can just look at number versus number and no problem. Where we get into some issues are the developments in equipment. Now, equipment can both mean equipment that the competitors are using, like a log that actually was not made from a tree cut down in the forest behind them 10 minutes before they lifted it, to a smooth, nice log with chalk all over it. Okay. There's exposure to the equipment. We train on logs all the time. They might have just seen the log for the first time. That certainly needs to be taken into account. But then we also have equipment improvements. Did a deadlift suit go from a single ply to a double ply to a triple ply? Are we talking about a log press record with triple ply Cerberus elbow sleeves that are really, really tight? Or are we talking about a log press record before any sort of real supportive elbow sleeve existed? Well, this is where we get into the nuance of the conversation. We also have supplementing advancements. The one argument I will not accept is that there are more advanced training programs now, because okay, but you're still actually doing more. And this is the crux of my final answer. If there was no significant equipment or exposure limitation or consideration that needs to be made for an older strongman event, I don't think it deserves more credit. If we look at something like the Flintstone lift back when they did it years and years and years ago, I believe before I was born, and we compare that to the Flintstone lift that we did in 2022, do I believe that all the guys in 2022 who lifted more than the world record deserve more respect in the strength world than the guys who lifted the barbell at a lighter weight, same barbell, back in the day? 4 guys who had exposure to barbells all the time. Yes, I do. I think the guy who set the world record back then deserves less credit for lifting that weight than someone who lifted more of the exact same weight in the exact same way, not the exact same way, lifted more weight in the exact same way a few decades later. Full stop. But do I believe a 210 kilo log press today can be accurately compared to a 160 kilo world record log press on an old log that they had never seen and they're just trying to make do? No, I actually think it's a different event altogether. And this is why we see these major improvements when you see an event come up over and over and over again. And that's actually why it's kind of convenient that shows choose to follow each other, because you do see the standard just rise and rise and rise. Not necessarily because you see what's possible, because I don't think that should be a major factor, but because you get exposure to training that over and over and over again. Now let's bring this back into the deadlift. Did Eddie or Thor have any limitation on their access to a deadlift bar and plates and ability to deadlift? Of course not. Did either of them have access to a suit that was some sort of advantage that couldn't have been had by the other? I don't believe so. Now, Thor used a chaos suit. I don't know how recently they were developed, but I don't think they existed in 2016 when Eddie lifted 500. But Eddie used a suit as well, and Eddie actually said, the suit actually doesn't help me that much. It helps me a lot, but I think once you get to a certain circumference and a certain voluptuousness, it actually just doesn't help, because it's so uncomfortable to wear it tight that it sort of balances itself out, maybe acts as a bit of a safety blanket. But there's no real equipment limitation there. Is there any dispute on the bar? No. Is there any dispute on the plates? No. So all we have is the nostalgia of learning that something was possible versus the greatest lift of all time. Where do I put my hat in the respect ring if I don't have 2 hats? To me, I think that if Eddie didn't lift 500 kilos, it would not have opened the door to somebody else lifting more than that. The caveat is, I believe that if Eddie didn't lift 500 kilos, that Thor would have lifted 500 kilos on that day in Birmingham at the Mutant Deadlift World Championships. So, where do we lie? I believe Eddie has a greater moment in strength sports and Thor has a better lift. Now, what do I give more credence to? A better moment in strength sports or a better lift, full stop? Well, my values personally lie in inspiration, in other people getting into the gym, in other people being healthy, and in the sport getting out there in a way that makes a meaningful impact in other people's lives. And I think that when Eddie lifted 500 kilos, people realized themselves that they could do more. The spiritual feeling that people have described to me that they felt when they were in the room when Eddie lifted 500 was something that I think is going to be hard to replicate in any lift ever, because I think this lift showed other people what they could do themselves. Now, with Thor's, I think he showed people that human beings can do a hell of a lot more than they thought at the top level. So the question remains, do I hold 500 kilos and inspiring other people that maybe the limits they set for themselves are far too low, or Thor's 5'10" and human beings can do way more than we thought they ever could at the top level? And for me, I hold a lot of regard for the ordinary person, as I said before. So I'm sticking with Eddie's lift for that reason, but I think Thor has shown a completely different side, that the top of human performance can only be pushed further. And really, who knows what that ceiling is going to be? Go ahead, pop in the comments what you think the best lift is, if you had to choose one or the other, and why. And also, how far do you think Thor could push that 5'10"? Because again, it looked absolutely ridiculously easy. So hats off to both these guys, the best deadlifters of all time. And all you can say is kudos. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Until tomorrow, lift heavy and be kind.